District 17, serving her second term. Senator, Idaho's average teacher salary has increased by slightly more than 5% since the state adopted a 5-year plan to boost pay back in 2015. How do you feel about this? Are we moving on pace too slow? How do you feel about that?
You know, it's moving, and we're grateful for the movement, because for a long time that didn't exist. And so one of the things that we have and will continue to advocate for is increased teacher pay. We face some real struggles, especially in more rural counties who don't have a larger tax base that is willing to support local bonds.
Salaries have actually fallen for teachers in those areas.
They have, and you combine that with, increased healthcare costs and all these things, and it makes it difficult. We met over the interim with several rural superintendents, school superintendents, and you hear stories of them having teacher openings and not even getting applications for the jobs. So the fact that there has been a request to put some money into the career ladder and fund that is helpful, but we're not seeing that as being quite enough, especially for rural schools.
What can the state do to recruit teachers?
Well, we, in addition to paying teachers what they're worth, and in my mind they're almost invaluable for the job that they do, the House side, two of our representatives on the House side, Representative Maryanne Jordan and Representative Sally Toon, are proposing a bill that would repay portions of student loans for teachers that agree to teach in rural schools.
Kind of like certain communities do with doctors and whatnot.
Right, a loan forgiveness program, and for each year you're there, that would be a $3,000 reduction on your student loans. And that's, as we all know, people are graduating more frequently with increased student debt. So hopefully that'll be a piece of the puzzle that might help some of those recruitments.
Now, the state has infused $75 million in the first 2 years into the program, but this year is like balloon payment year, right? It's $62 million this year?
I believe it's 58, but right in that general area, and around $60 million. And yeah, this was the year that the full funding for the career ladder needed to happen, and that is something that we are in support of. It is not time to back down now. We've made progress on that, and we need to keep going on the recommendations of the task force. Are
the larger districts having any trouble getting applicants, or is it just the rural places?
Well, they're not having the same kind of trouble, but we see an interesting dynamic. I mean, the job that teachers do is really remarkable, and I don't believe that teachers and some other public servants are paid in a lot of areas what they are worth. So you see a challenge in convincing young people to go into teaching.
Yeah, that's one of the big detriments is there aren't any.
Right, what is the incentive, right? So if we can improve teacher pay, if we can let teachers teach, and they know best how to engage their kids, and if we can help them out with their student loans, then hopefully those incentives will help improve the situation.
On the national front, in that regard, a lot of teachers, I've been looking at Facebook and Twitter and everything else, and just about every teacher that I come in contact with is posting something about the new proposed Secretary of Education saying no, please no, because apparently she's not even for public education.
Well, it's hard for me to imagine a person who has never had any documented interaction with public education at all.
Yeah, she didn't go to public school.
Being in charge of public school.
Kids didn't go to public school, hasn't been a teacher, hasn't taken education classes.
So the qualification piece is a bit of a mystery to me, and it's worrisome. I think that there's a lot of uncertainty right now. People are concerned about what may happen. And I'm sure that as things begin to move forward, we're going to see some things that may be helpful. And I hear from people every day that are afraid. They're afraid about losing their local public school. When you have families, especially in Idaho, where wages are low, and parents, it's either single parents or even two-parent families that are having to work 2-3 jobs. It's very difficult for them. They can't homeschool their kids. It's difficult for them to even engage at their local public school, and that school is so integral to their kids and their kids' future.
Right.
And to think about pulling resources away from those rather than building them up is kind of scary.
And the country originally came up with public education because so many people couldn't afford to pay for education, and by the way, they still can't.
And what we really can't afford is to not educate our kids, because then the costs get extremely real later on. You raise generations who aren't qualified for jobs, who don't learn how to really read very well, and they struggle their whole life, and it can be generational. And public schools have helped that in a big, big way.
What happens when this 5 years is up? Is there going to be a crisis situation then? Or are you going to add another 5 years? What's going to happen?
Well, the 5 years is an implementation period.
Sure.
And so it's putting the program in place, and it's being put in place with a mind towards sustaining it over time. It isn't like something that's going to sunset and go away. But it's certainly not the end of the conversation. I mean, we can't implement these recommendations over the course of 5 years and then just kind of wash our hands and say, okay, we're done now.
Yeah,
we don't
we've
have
caught
to
up,
fund
we're good.
education anymore.
One recruiting to retaining.
Boise State does a public policy survey that they released last week, and education is always top of mind for Idahoans.
That's good. We're talking with Senator Maryanne Jordan, the Minority Caucus Chair. Take 45. Time for a final check of right now traffic brought to you.
Idaho Talks Live. What overall is the spirit down at the Capitol about healthcare?
Well, I think that we have been very successful in raising the awareness of this issue in the last few sessions. Task force recommendations twice have shown that Medicaid expansion would be critical to Idaho, not only to serving the folks in the Gap, but economically as well. And the work group over the summer, and I was a participant in that work group, did agree that something's got to be done for the folks in the Gap. Now, getting to what that something is our challenge. I think that we spoke earlier of the BSU survey.
Right.
And healthcare this year shot up to the number 2 concern within margin of error of education. So that tells me that it is an issue all over the state, and that people understand that it's an issue. So we unfortunately, we as Democrats have advocated for Medicaid expansion for several years now, and unfortunately that has not happened. And it is now, given the conversation nationally about what may or may not happen with healthcare, left us in an even more precarious position. If the Affordable Care Act is repealed, and folks lose their subsidies on the exchange, folks who are receiving their health care through the exchange, estimates show between 80 and 100,000 Idahoans losing their health insurance. So in addition to the 78,000 people in the Gap, we more than double that number.
Wow.
And we've got a major health care crisis.
How do we, if we expand Medicaid, how do we afford that?
Well, the expansion is actually the most affordable way to go about addressing the Gap. We talk about finding an Idaho solution, but inherent in that conversation is the fact that an Idaho solution is paid for strictly with Idaho tax dollars. There are matching funds available where the federal government pays the majority of the Medicaid, and it allows people to access health insurance. And when they have that health insurance, and if they have a catastrophic accident or discover something that needs surgery or chemotherapy or whatever it might be, that is covered by insurance instead of these people being bankrupted by medical bills and the counties having to pick up those medical bills through their catastrophic funds. So it reduces the burden on the counties, and it also brings dollars in a way that are able to hire medical professionals and solve a lot of the shortage problems that Idaho has in that profession. So there are still states that are talking about expansion, even in today's environment.
Yesterday, several governors got together and recommended to the new administration that they do not just broom Obamacare or the Affordable Health Care Act, whatever you want to call it, don't just broom the whole thing, but rather keep portions of it or modify portions of it. So you're really in a state of flux here as to what to do, right?
Well, and those governors are right, and those governors are also it's a bipartisan
Yes.
effort. I mean, any state, red or blue state, that has expanded Medicaid has seen the benefits, and states who haven't are working in one way or another to try to get to a place where they can address their problems. And yeah, we are in a real quandary because the repeal piece is easy. You can
Sure.
write a bill and make something go away. But what you're making go away is health care for 20 million people, and a good chunk of them live in Idaho.
We have just about a minute left. Let's talk quickly about transportation. There's a surplus eliminator, and go ahead and explain that if you
Yeah,
would.
the surplus eliminator in 30 seconds.
Oh, right.
Was a bill that passed a couple of years ago that said that whatever surplus is left at the end of the year for the state, half of that surplus goes into the rainy day fund, and the other half goes to transportation to try to address the backlog in transportation, bridges, repairs, and so on. That sunsets this year.
Right.
So, from an economic standpoint, infrastructure is important, transportation is important. We've got to keep everything moving. And so it was not a big part of the governor's speech, but I think there are some in the legislature who still think that we can't just feel like we fixed it by just funding for 2 years.
And a lot of that's regular maintenance that should be, being completed. Yeah.
Especially bridges.
Right.
That's the biggest piece of it. Bridges that have been out of whack for quite a while.
Yeah, bridges and trying to get from Napa to Caldwell.
Yeah, and that's kind of raising the issue again. Having to close it for pothole repair is not an efficient way to go about road maintenance.
Thank you, Maryanne. Senator
Thank you.
Maryanne Jordan, Minority Caucus Chair, has been our guest this morning on Minority Friday. It's 8:56. Idaho Talks Live continues.